Hi, I'm Ophelia. At the annual board gala, my CEO father-in-law looked me dead in the eye, in front of everyone, and said, "You're just a gatekeeper. This company has no place for failures like you." Then they laughed, all of them. I stood there, holding the mic, frozen. But 30 seconds later, the CEO of Microsoft walked in and said my name first. And in that silence, my father-in-law's face turned white. But that wasn't the real humiliation. The real story? It's about what I built behind their backs and how I took everything they said I didn't deserve. Before we dive in, where are you listening from, and what would you have done if your own family looked at you like a mistake? Drop it in the comments. I read every word. The marble lobby floor gleamed like glass under the high chandeliers, catching each step like it mattered. I adjusted the brass clip on my blazer. Just a small letter opener shaped like a feather. It used to sit on my mentor's desk until the day she passed. Now it sat over my heart, silent but sharp. Mark stood beside me in a tailored navy suit, hair swept back like he was born into legacy. In many ways, he had been. As the son of Douglas Brenmore, yes, that Brenmore, Mark was corporate royalty. And tonight we were here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Brenmore Tech. He checked his phone again. I tried not to let it bother me. "Let's not be late," I said, smoothing the front of my blazer. "We're not," he replied flatly, still tapping. We walked past towering floral arrangements and servers balancing champagne flutes like acrobats. I nodded to a few of the senior engineers I worked with daily, though most barely registered me. Funny how being the executive assistant to the CTO meant I was invisible and indispensable at once. Inside the ballroom, a string quartet played some modern piece arranged to sound classical, pretentious and expensive, just like everything else tonight. The glass doors shimmered closed behind us. Mark led me straight toward the inner circle, where Douglas stood laughing with the board. My stomach tightened. The closer we got, the more the air changed. Lighter on the outside, heavier near him. The way humidity clings before a storm. "Ophelia!" Douglas bellowed when he saw me. "You're here? Excellent. Folks, this is Ophelia. She married my son after charming him in the mailroom." There was a chuckle from someone behind me. My skin flushed hot. "She's the company's most loyal gatekeeper," Douglas continued, raising his glass. "Let her through and you can schedule a meeting. Just don't expect a promotion. We don't hire failures." I smiled. It was faint, controlled, but I smiled, because that's what you do when your father-in-law mocks you like an unpaid intern in front of 50 shareholders. You smile so they can't say you broke. There was laughter, the kind that's more cruel because it's subtle, corporate laughter, safe, hollow, practiced. I turned to Mark. He lifted his glass, clinked it lightly against his father's, not even a glance at me. His jaw didn't twitch. No hesitation, just a son agreeing with his father, silently. That silence? It rang louder than the music. It wasn't the first time he had left me alone in a room full of wolves, but it was the first time I realized he might have handed them the map. I excused myself, walked slowly toward the far end of the ballroom near the large window overlooking Market Street. I needed air, but not enough to leave. Not yet. I stared out into the city, its lights blinking like a code I couldn't quite break. It was beautiful, yes, but that night, it also felt indifferent. I pressed my fingertips against the cold glass. They trembled slightly, so I tucked them in, wrapping them around my brass clip like it could anchor me. I thought of the countless late nights I'd stayed behind to make sure the CTO had everything she needed, the innovation meetings I prepped, the presentations I built from scratch that others claimed credit for. All those years I told myself that loyalty was a kind of power. But tonight, standing alone with a champagne glass I hadn't touched, I started to think power looked a lot like silence, and maybe not in the good way. A chime echoed across the room. Then the MC's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest joining us tonight, a leader whose work has transformed our industry. Please welcome the CEO of Microsoft." The crowd turned. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. I didn't. I stayed still, one hand still on that brass clip, because I already knew. I felt it in my bones the second the air changed. Again. My heart thudded once, like a bell struck hard. I whispered, mostly to myself, I used to think silence was strength, but strength looks different tonight. Then I turned around, just as the doors opened, and he walked in, straight toward me. For half a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard, maybe the echo in the marble-floored lobby played tricks on my ears. But then, as I turned slowly, the room hushed into a tension so thick it swallowed every clink of glass and shuffled heel. There he was, Alan Delmore, the Alan Delmore, CEO of Microsoft, navy blazer, crisp open collar, and a calm smile that said he didn't need to impress anyone. The man who could buy this entire building without blinking. And he was walking straight toward me. Not toward Douglas Brenmore, who was already stretching out his hand like a groom waiting at the altar. Not toward the CFO, who stood puffed up near the champagne pyramid, ready for a handshake. No, Alan's stride was clean and sure, his eyes locked on mine. "Ophelia," he beamed, "I didn't know you'd be here. Thank you for the partnership package last week. Stellar insight." Every breath in the ballroom seemed to vanish. I didn't respond right away. I was too busy watching Mark's face blanch and Douglas's hand hang mid-air like someone had forgotten to hit resume. Behind me, I heard a glass tap against a plate, then go still. "I appreciate that," I finally managed, offering a soft smile, one practiced through years of enduring. "Didn't think I'd see you here either." Alan chuckled and leaned in slightly, not too close, but just enough to make sure the next words landed where they needed to. "That redline summary you added? Saved us 2 months. You've got a sharp eye. Keep doing what you're doing." And just like that, he gave my arm a light, respectful squeeze and turned toward the open bar. But the damage, if you could call it that, was already done. All around me, voices began to murmur. Names were whispered. Some turned to look again, unsure what they'd just witnessed. Douglas's face tightened behind his professional smile. He let out a shallow laugh and glanced around, pretending to share in some inside joke. But it didn't stick. Mark, standing beside me, reached out and wrapped his fingers around my arm, not harshly, but with enough force to communicate one clear message: control. "What the hell was that?" he muttered through clenched teeth. "You two on a first-name basis now?" I gently pulled my arm from his grasp and looked him straight in the eye. "You never asked what I really do after hours." He blinked. Once, twice. Before he could say anything else, Douglas swept in, his tone dipped in something syrupy. "Alan's full of surprises tonight, but Ophelia, dear, I didn't know you were consulting with tech giants, no less." He emphasized the word consulting, like it left a bad taste in his mouth. I kept my voice even. "I do a little advising, quietly." "Clearly not that quietly," he replied with a dry laugh, before slipping away to chase Alan. Mark was still staring at me, as though trying to recognize someone who'd been standing in his living room for years. "You've been hiding this?" he asked. "No," I said, tilting my head. "You just never thought to ask." There was no venom in my voice, just the weight of a simple truth. The memory came uninvited. 2 years ago, me in a modest shared workspace on the outskirts of Menlo Park. No heels, no suits, no polite small talk, just whiteboards, burning ideas, and late-night coffee. Back then, I had been attending an open strategy roundtable for startup founders, something I'd found by accident while researching operational bottlenecks for Brenmore. One team caught my eye. 3 immigrant engineers building an AI framework for accessibility tech. No corporate polish, but their minds were lightning. They were struggling with workflows, hiring chaos, scalability nightmares. I offered to help, not as a client, not for cash, just quietly. 1 document became 10. I rewrote their onboarding tree, refined their budgeting process, helped them frame a pitch to a VC firm. I never told Mark. I never told anyone. Then, 6 weeks ago, that very startup, Streamframe, was acquired by Microsoft in a hush-hush $112 million deal. Alan Delmore's fingerprints were all over it. Apparently, so were mine. I sipped my wine slowly, eyes drifting to the far end of the ballroom. Alan had now gathered a group of board members and was addressing them. A few nodded toward me. Others didn't know where to look. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alan's voice carried through the mic, clear and calm. "Before we raise our glasses tonight, I want to recognize someone in this room who made a real difference this quarter, though she probably wouldn't say so herself." Mark tensed beside me. She didn't lead the meetings. She didn't write press releases, but behind one of the most forward-leaning acquisitions we've had this year was her insight, her structure, her quiet brilliance. "Ophelia, thank you. You helped us see what we needed before it was obvious." My throat tightened, not with emotion, but with something more centered. A long pause echoed around the room. A few awkward claps, then more, then a slow, sincere applause that spread like fire. Douglas let out a cough that doubled as a laugh, trying to catch up with the moment. Mark's jaw didn't move, but his grip on his wine glass looked like it might turn it to powder. I raised my glass. Not high, not dramatic. Just enough. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Grace doesn't need to shout. As the applause tapered off, I caught Alan's eye again from across the room. He gave a brief nod, one of those gestures that meant more than a trophy ever could. And in that moment, with all eyes now uncertain whether to look at me or away, I realized the joke from earlier was no longer funny. I wasn't the punchline anymore. The garage door hummed shut behind us, sealing in a thick electric quiet. Mark parked the car with a sharp jerk, threw it into park, and didn't bother turning toward me. He got out, walking ahead like I was some assistant trailing behind him, not his wife of 9 years. I followed him in silence, the echo of my heels against the marble floor of our penthouse more pointed than usual. The city shimmered beyond the glass walls, but inside everything had gone dim. He set his keys down with more force than necessary. I waited, thinking he might break the silence, but he just moved to the bar, pulled out a tumbler, and poured bourbon. Neat. I didn't sit. Instead, I leaned against the kitchen island, arms crossed. "Mark." He looked up, glass halfway to his lips. "Do you want to talk about what happened tonight?" His expression didn't move, but his jaw tensed. "What's there to talk about?" I exhaled slowly. "That look on your face back at the ballroom. You were blindsided, I get it." He finally spoke. "You lied to me, Ophelia." "I didn't." "You kept secrets." "I didn't," I repeated, voice calm. "You never asked. You never cared to ask what I was working on, and I stopped offering when it became clear you weren't listening." He took a long sip. "You made me look like a fool." I swallowed down a dozen things I wanted to say. That wasn't my intention, but I won't apologize for being respected, especially when that respect wasn't handed to me through bloodlines or last names. Mark gave a bitter laugh. "Of course, drag my father into it." "He dragged me first. That dinner wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. I just refused to play the part they wrote for me." He didn't reply, just stared into his glass like it might give him answers I couldn't. The space between us stretched wider than the kitchen island. I could almost see the line he'd drawn across the marble, him on one side, nursing his pride, me on the other, holding my ground. I turned to go upstairs, but hours later, I was still awake, restless. The silence between us had grown into something jagged, something that cut without touching. I walked toward the guest room, an excuse to clear my mind, but paused as I passed the office. The door was cracked, light spilled out. Mark's voice drifted through the sliver of open space. "No, she won't see it coming. She's too proud. But trust me, she's not going to walk away from this untouched." My heart froze. I didn't breathe. I stood still, just long enough to hear the silence return. Then I backed away quietly, barefoot, not daring to let the floor creak. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, blinking at the city beyond the glass. Then I grabbed my laptop. If he was planning something, I needed to know how deep it ran. I logged into our shared business drive. We both had access, until now. Something felt off. I checked the folders we both used weekly, One was missing. A crucial one, marked 2023 Strategy, Ops Review. Gone. I blinked again, refreshed, still gone. I checked permissions. Mine had been revoked. My name wasn't even listed. That folder contained the operational notes I'd built from the ground up. That project was my contribution. Unpaid, unofficial, invisible. Exactly how Mark liked it. I sat back. He was erasing me, not from the company, from its memory. A ping broke the silence. Email. No subject, no sender, just a forwarded message. I clicked. The thread opened to an internal memo. The header bore the familiar watermark of Brenmore Capital, my father-in-law's company. It was from Douglas. I read slowly. Proposal. Internal restructure recommendation. Halfway down, my name appeared. Clinical, cold. A bullet point under Proposed Phase 1 Changes. Terminate advisory capacity for Ophelia M. Ellison, potential conflict of interest given external Microsoft partnership. I sat there, gripping the laptop like it might slip out of my hands. Conflict of interest? He was twisting the Microsoft deal, my proudest, cleanest work, into a weapon. They were going to push me out, and they'd use my own success to do it. Mark, Douglas, maybe more. I stared at the screen for a long time. They thought I'd yell, break something, cry, maybe even beg, but I wouldn't give them that. I closed the laptop and stood. If this was war, I'd fight it on my terms, and I knew exactly who I needed to call. Someone who'd known the whole story, since the beginning. The next morning, I woke up early, not because I'd slept well, but because sleep had finally given up on me. Mark had left sometime before dawn. I didn't hear the door, just the faint clink of his cufflinks and the smell of the cologne he always overused when he wanted to feel in control. I stayed in bed a few minutes longer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant city hum rise with the sun. By 9 a.m., I was already on the freeway heading south. The traffic on 101 was surprisingly light for a weekday. The rhythm of tires on asphalt gave me time to think. I hadn't been back to Palo Alto in years, not since the early days before Mark, before the glossy boardroom suits, before any of them knew my name. Back then, I was just a scrappy research analyst in a shared apartment, trying to pitch a predictive health platform to anyone who'd listen. Most ignored me. Some laughed. But one man had called me back. Mr. Hargrove. He wasn't just the CEO of the firm back then, he was the gatekeeper. He took a chance on me when no one else would. I still remembered his exact words during our first coffee at Phil's. You don't have the last name, but you have the mind. I pulled into a small lot behind the cafe where we'd first met. It was still there. Smaller now, a little more crowded with newer places around it. But something about the green awning and mismatched patio chairs made me feel grounded. I stepped inside, and there he was. He hadn't changed much. A little more silver in his hair, a few new creases around his eyes. But his presence still commanded respect, like time hadn't dared to touch that part of him. Ophelia, he said, rising from the booth slowly, a genuine smile touching his face. You still drive yourself? I needed the time to think, I replied, slipping into the seat across from him. And Uber just didn't feel right for this. We ordered coffee, nothing fancy. Just dark roast, no sugar, like we used to. He leaned forward. So, tell me what they did. I didn't flinch. I told him everything. The engagement party, the way Mark sat silent while I was humiliated in front of the family, Douglas's little proposal to remove me from the board, the memo, the erasure. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I warned them about Douglas years ago. He plays the long game, but he only plays it for himself. Mark's not innocent either, I said quietly. No, Hargrove agreed, but Mark never had vision. He followed whoever gave him power. First me, then Douglas. He never really understood you. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness matching my mood. I still don't know how they thought I wouldn't fight back, I murmured. Because they forgot who brought you in, he said. And why? He reached into his worn leather bag and pulled out a small external drive. I archived everything when I retired. There's a folder in here I think you should read. Your hiring file, internal emails, my own notes. I hesitated for a second. Why now? Because I believe in what I believed then, he said simply, and because you deserve to know the whole truth. We parted an hour later. He patted my hand before I left, his expression unreadable. Don't fight them on their battlefield, Ophelia, he said as I stood. Make them come to yours. The drive back felt heavier. I didn't even turn on music. I needed silence for what came next. By the time I got home, the sun had already dipped below the skyline. The penthouse was still. Mark hadn't returned, and I was grateful. I plugged in the drive and opened the archive. There it was, a folder labeled Ophelia, Higher Docs 2017. I clicked, slowly. The first file was an email thread between Douglas and Mark, from Douglas Holloway to Mark Holloway, date April 14, 2017, subject Microsoft shortlist candidate, Ophelia Rivera. She's not aligned with our long-term brand, no pedigree, no legacy. I'd advise against it, too much risk. Then Mark's response, from Mark Holloway to Douglas Holloway, date April 14, 2017. Agreed, she's not one of us, but if Microsoft's pushing her, we can use it to make the board happy. Keep her contained to advisory. I froze. I had read hundreds of cold emails in my life, but none of them had made me feel like I was staring through a window into a lie I'd been living for years. I wasn't hired because I impressed them. I was a checkbox, a branding move, a strategic convenience. Only Hargrove had seen more. He had written a final note in the folder, short, almost like a diary entry. She doesn't play their game. That's why she'll win it. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence press in. Every doubt I'd ever carried, that maybe Mark had believed in me, that maybe I was ever truly part of their family, faded like smoke. They'd never seen me as one of them, and now I didn't need to be. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and grabbed my phone. I called my attorney first. We need to review the shareholder structure and prep a proposal for reorganization, quietly. Then I opened a private folder in my own drive, one I'd been quietly building for nearly a year. A new venture, no shared assets, no overlap with the firm, my own IP, my own rules. They thought cutting me off would end me. They didn't realize I was just getting started. They built a fortress of arrogance, too high to notice who was watching from below. And now they'd left the back door open, just wide enough for me to step through. It started with an email. Not to me. Of course not. I wasn't supposed to know about the private dinner at the top floor of the headquarters. An intimate evening for board members and their families to reconnect after the quarterly close, it said, the kind of event where alliances were solidified over $200 steaks and vintage wine. The email was forwarded by mistake. Mark's new assistant, a young woman I'd never met, must have thought she was looping me in for logistics. She didn't notice my name wasn't on the guest list, but I did. Instead of confronting Mark, instead of reacting with the fire they all expected me to burn with, I took a different route. I called the concierge at the tower. My name still held weight with their private club, and I quietly reserved a seat. Table 1C, tucked near the windows, far from the main circle, but still inside the room where it mattered. I didn't need their permission to sit at the table. I just needed to be seen. The dinner was held 1 week later, on a Thursday evening. San Francisco shimmered through the glass, a quilt of lights beyond the skyline. I arrived 15 minutes before the official start time, stepping out of a black sedan wearing a tailored navy suit that hadn't seen the light of day since my last keynote address. I checked in without a hitch. The hostess smiled, recognized my name, and guided me toward the private elevator. "Your seat is ready, Ms. Emery." As the doors closed behind me, I caught my reflection. I didn't look like someone begging for inclusion. I looked like someone who had already made up her mind. The room itself was candlelit and filled with hushed murmurs, executives with their spouses, a few adult children, and Mark, seated beside Douglas at the head of the long mahogany table. Their laughter froze mid-sentence when I entered. I saw it clearly in Mark's eyes, the flicker of surprise, and something else too, fear. Douglas stiffened, his hand gripping a wine glass, paused in midair. One of the junior partners glanced toward the doorway, unsure if he should stand. No one did. I walked in slowly, gracefully, as if nothing was wrong at all. The hostess led me to the far end of the table, where a junior analyst named Brett, maybe 27, stood and offered to help with my chair. I smiled and took the seat. From where I sat, I had a full view of the head of the table. I watched as Douglas whispered something to Mark, who kept his jaw locked and eyes downward. Not once did he meet my gaze. The first 20 minutes passed in uncomfortable pleasantries. People pretended to sip wine and ask about summer plans. I let the silence settle around me like armor. I was polite, pleasant even, laughing softly at Brett's nervous jokes and asking about his recent portfolio work. Then, dessert was served. Douglas, with his sleeves rolled and false charm sharpened, raised his glass. "To loyalty," he said, looking straight at Mark and then sideways at me. "To those who build, who stay the course, and who don't treat this company like a revolving door." A few nods, a few clinks of crystal. I picked up my water glass, held it for a moment, then set it down. I didn't lift it. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a plain white envelope on the table. Slowly, deliberately, I slid it across the polished surface, toward Douglas. He didn't touch it, but he stared at it, like it might burn through his hands. "No toast from you, Ophelia?" he said, still trying to play smug. I looked at him, calm and clear. "Some people clean quietly," I said. "Others wait until the rot shows up in quarterly audits." A hush fell. Forks stopped moving. Napkins froze in midair. "That envelope," I added, "contains emails from 2017, threads where you advised the board against hiring me, where you called me a political risk and pedigree deficient. And Mark," I glanced at him now, his face pale, "called me an unknown asset that might cost too much to train." I stood, still quiet, still calm. "I wasn't supposed to be here, I get that now. I was never part of your plan. But I'll be part of your reckoning." No one spoke, not even the ones who usually had something clever to say. I left the envelope on the table and walked out before dessert. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. The concierge offered to call a car for me, but I shook my head. I needed the night air. San Francisco's wind hit my cheeks like a cleansing breath. I walked for a block before I heard my name. It was Mark. He'd followed me to the sidewalk, his jacket flapping behind him, eyes wide, mouth open but silent. "You didn't even deny it," I said. "You never once said it wasn't true." He didn't. He stood there, still and small. "I'm done waiting for apologies that won't come." I turned and walked toward the corner. That night, I deleted his contact from my phone. I didn't hesitate, and when I got home, my lawyer's message blinked on the screen. "Everything's ready. One signature triggers the clause. They'll freeze board bonuses immediately." I sat at my desk and looked out the window at the city I used to think I had to earn a place in. Not anymore. He thought I'd come to beg for a seat. I came to burn the table. And 2 days later, I arrived with the matches. That morning, the fog over the Bay Bridge was just beginning to lift when I walked into Ms. DeWitt's office. Her assistant offered coffee. I declined. There were decisions waiting, ones I wouldn't need caffeine to stay awake for. Ms. DeWitt looked up from the thick binder on her desk. "You sure you're ready for this, Ophelia?" I sat down slowly, placing my bag next to the chair. "I've been ready since they wrote me out of my own name." She slid the papers forward, the founder's override clause, buried deep in the original trust agreement, put there decades ago for emergency use only, the kind of clause you forget about when you assume the quiet daughter won't read the fine print. But I had, and I'd documented every line they crossed. "The evidence you submitted," she began, tapping her finger on a folder filled with printed emails and audit trails, "meets the breach threshold. They blocked executive hiring, manipulated profit forecasts, and suppressed governance changes without full board vote. That's mismanagement. No ambiguity. I signed the activation request. 2 strokes of ink. That's all it took to freeze their bonuses, pause their voting rights, and suspend their access to company strategic decisions for 90 days. By the time I reached the elevator, emails were already flying out to each member of the board. I didn't need to be in the room when Douglas opened his. The wind picked up as I walked across the plaza. A woman near the fountain looked up from her phone, eyes wide. "Are you—" I just nodded once, then kept walking. Later that afternoon, I returned to headquarters, through the front doors this time, not the side entrance I used to prefer. The marble lobby echoed with hurried footsteps and whispers. Security guards stood stiffer than usual. Something was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Then the elevator dinged open, and Douglas appeared. He marched in like the building still belonged to him, his coat flaring with each stride. Behind him trailed his legal counsel, someone I recognized from last year's shareholder summit. He pushed past the reception desk, ignoring the stunned looks from the staff. I stood quietly near the side hallway, watching. At the far end, near the elevator banks that led to the legal division, stood Reuben Langford, former FBI, now head of corporate security. I'd brought him in privately 3 months ago, on retainer. No one knew but me and Ms. DeWitt. Douglas spotted him and smirked. "Reuben, step aside. I'm going upstairs." Reuben didn't flinch. He held up a tablet. "Mr. Fairfax, per updated security protocols, you are not authorized access to levels 10 through 15. Legal and trust affairs are restricted zones pending review." "You're kidding," Douglas barked. Reuben remained calm. "Not kidding. This order came directly from the trust administrator and from Ms. Ophelia Fairfax. If you'd like to contest it, I suggest contacting your counsel." I could see the veins pulsing in Douglas's neck. Cameras near the reception area turned slightly. I wasn't the only one watching anymore. Douglas leaned in. "This is a mistake. She doesn't have the authority." Reuben's reply was almost gentle. "She does. Now if you'd please step aside." For the first time in my life, I saw my father backpedal. Not because of fear, but because he realized he no longer controlled the room. He turned, his face red, muttering something under his breath as he stormed back toward the revolving doors. I didn't follow. Instead, I took the elevator up 1 level, to communications. Within the hour, I'd written and reviewed a short internal memo. No names, no accusations, just 3 paragraphs about the importance of trust, truth, and what happens when silence is no longer acceptable. I ended it with a sentence I'd been repeating in my head for weeks. "Power isn't in the hands of those who speak loudest, but those who stay standing when the shouting ends." By 6:30 p.m., the message had reached every corner of the company, 4,700 inboxes pinged at once. By 10 p.m., someone had screenshot it and posted it online. By midnight, the quote was on LinkedIn, Twitter, and even the evening news ticker, and by morning, I wasn't invisible anymore. As I sat by the window of my apartment, sipping lukewarm tea and watching the city blink awake, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. Just 5 words. "Why are you doing this?" I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed back, "You always knew who your father was. You just didn't know who I was." I turned off my phone. No second guess. No hesitation. Outside, a black car pulled up. My first investor roundtable was in less than an hour. I stood, pulled my coat over my shoulders, and walked to the elevator. They tried to block me out of the company. Now I hold the only keys that matter. I didn't need a parade. I needed a door to open, quietly, without ceremony, and on time. At 9:03 a.m., it did. The thick double doors of the founder's room swung inward with that familiar whisper of polished hinges and old authority. The board was already seated, 10 men and women in suits that cost more than most people's cars, waiting with their polite resentment and sharpened silence. Douglas sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes expectant. "Ophelia," he said evenly. Not a greeting, just a placeholder. I stepped in alone. No legal team, no personal assistant, Just me, my leather binder, and the truth. I walked the length of the table slowly, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. "Good morning, Margaret, Darren, Celeste." I didn't skip a name, but not one of them responded, not even a nod. It didn't surprise me. They thought this meeting would bury me. Douglas cleared his throat. "This emergency session is to address the current destabilization efforts, spearheaded by Ms. Ophelia Reed. Her actions, including suspension of board powers, have shaken investor confidence and put the company at risk." He didn't look at me as he said it. He looked at the others, playing to his gallery. "We've tolerated long enough her hostility and paranoia. I am moving to formally censure and vote for her removal from all strategic roles." He reached for a stack of documents in front of him, probably prepared overnight by someone who still believed I was the weak link. "Before you do that," I said, setting my binder down gently, "I'd like to clarify a few things." Douglas leaned back. "Unless you're here with an apology and a resignation, I'm not sure." "I'm here with neither," I said, calm and measured. "But I did bring something you forgot." I opened the binder, revealing a slim stack of documents and a small worn lab logbook, its pages stained with ink and time. "This," I said, placing the book on the table, "is the original development log for our glucose-adaptive polymer, the one that changed everything for us." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I co-authored the prototype," I continued. "All early results, notes, and iterations, my handwriting, my data, and this?" I tapped the notarized page tucked behind plastic. "Is the patent application filed 5 years ago?" Douglas's eyes narrowed slightly. "The one your father signed off on. His signature is right here. Witnessed, logged, filed with the USPTO." A few heads turned. Celeste leaned forward just slightly. "You mean to say—" Darren began, his voice thin. "I'm co-patent holder," I said, letting it land, "on the core product responsible for 72% of our current revenue, which, per our corporate bylaws, guarantees intellectual stakeholding, regardless of board status." I let the silence sit for a moment. Douglas didn't speak. His lips were pressed into a tight, bloodless line. "And," I added, sliding the second page out, "I'm not the only stakeholder asserting board rights today." I turned toward the far wall where a screen displayed the company's ownership ledger. "We've received formal notice that a silent investor is activating their voting power." More heads turned. I tapped the screen, and the company logo was replaced by a foundation name most of them had seen on annual donations, but never questioned. "The Lyra Foundation," I said. "Established 14 years ago by Lyra Adair, my late aunt. You might remember her, or not, but she left me more than just cookbooks and scrapbooks." Darren squinted. "That trust owns stock?" "Not just stock," I said. 11.7% of voting shares, enough to break any false majority." No one spoke. I heard someone's breath hitch near the far end of the table. Douglas's hands had shifted, fingers clenching slightly, knuckles pale. "The Foundation's representative has already submitted the formal notice. Effective this morning, they are exercising full board voting rights." Celeste finally spoke. "That gives you effective control." "No," I corrected gently. "It gives the company balance, something it's been missing." A beat passed, then another. Without a word, Margaret pushed her chair back and stood. She looked tired. Her blazer was crisp, but her eyes weren't. "I'm resigning," she said simply. "Effective immediately." She walked out. Moments later, Darren followed, muttering something about not being paid enough to fight ghosts. Douglas tried. He did. "This is manipulation," he barked. "This is emotional blackmail under the guise of legality. None of this has been approved by—" "It was," I interrupted. "You just didn't think I'd read the fine print." He stood sharply, face flushed. "I moved to remove Ophelia Reed from the board." "No second," Celeste said, arms crossed. Douglas turned to the youngest member, Dev Patel, mid-30s, razor-sharp and tired of the old games. Dev leaned forward. "I support the future, and she's sitting right there." He nodded at me, not deferentially, just with clarity. I met his eyes and gave a small nod back. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't need to. Douglas sat down slowly, like he finally felt the gravity of what he'd lost. I closed my binder. Across the table, Celeste stared at me. "What are you going to do now?" I looked at the engraved plaque at the head of the table, the one that still bore my father-in-law's name. "Start rewriting the story," I said, from the seat they tried to erase. I didn't linger after the meeting. I let the silence speak for itself. As I walked down the corridor, each footstep echoed against the polished marble floors like a quiet drum roll, announcing not a victory, but a return. Not just to the building, but to myself. I passed the frosted glass of the executive suite, once mine, then taken, now restored. Inside, the space looked almost untouched. Same minimalist desk, same books on the shelf, still alphabetized the way I left them. But on the glass wall behind the desk, someone had etched the phrase, "Founders move the world." I didn't smile. I just sat down and slid open the top drawer. It was still there. The tan folder I'd stashed during my last week, back when I'd first sensed Douglas was circling. I had labeled it simply, "In case they forget." I flipped it open and ran my hand across the top document, a certified copy of my prenup, not the version filed with the county, but the original notarized bundle. Douglas had signed it himself, the day we co-signed the shareholder transfer agreement for the family-run portion of the business. "When someone thinks you're insignificant," I murmured, "they stop being careful." Tucked 3 pages in was the clause I'd insisted on, buried in legalese, just where he had told me no one would ever bother to read. It was barely 2 paragraphs long but carried the weight of a wrecking ball. If the undersigned party, Douglas Ward, or affiliated family stakeholders publicly denounce, defame, or exclude Ophelia Ward from family or company affairs in a manner causing reputational harm, all transferred shares revert to the originating stakeholder, Ophelia Ward, effective immediately. And he'd done it, on the record, in front of the entire board, twice. I leaned back in my chair, the silence in the room feeling lighter than before. The kind of silence that follows a decision, not a question. Still, I wasn't finished. That afternoon, I took the elevator to the subfloor where IT security was housed. It smelled like coffee and tired code. Carl, the head of the department, looked up from his desk, startled. "Ophelia, Director Ward, sorry, I didn't know you were—" "It's okay," I said calmly. "I need you to pull something for me. Internal access logs." He blinked. "From when?" "Start with last Tuesday. Someone logged into my account using credentials that should have been frozen, downloaded R&D files, specifically prototype versions. I want the IP address." Carl frowned, then nodded. "Give me an hour." It took him 40 minutes. I spent the wait drinking weak coffee from the staff machine and watching interns argue over an HDMI cable. Carl came back holding a printed sheet. "The session was traced to IP 192.14.877. That's registered to one of the private VPNs in the CEO's suite." I didn't need to ask who that meant. "And the device name?" I asked. Carl swallowed. "Doug Ward Lenovo 9. I took the paper, thanked him, and left. My next stop was downstairs, legal counsel. I walked in, handed them the printed log and the prenup clause, and said, "We need to file both a criminal complaint and a civil restraining order, today." The room went quiet. One of the lawyers glanced at the timestamp. "Unauthorized access, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, and with the clause, stock reversion." I nodded once. The paperwork moved quickly. By sunset, an injunction was filed, and Douglas's digital access was revoked from the central system. At 7:34 p.m., his office badge failed at the executive entrance. The security guard had to escort him out. No drama, no shouting, just a locked elevator and a stunned man gripping a leather briefcase like it might save him. I didn't watch him leave. I was upstairs, sitting at my desk again. The quiet was different this time. I opened a drawer and took out the small, silver-framed photo of my late Aunt Lyra. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-joke at a family picnic long before the fractures began. I placed the frame beside my monitor. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from internal ops. "Welcome back, Director Ophelia Ward." I looked out over the city lights flickering beyond the glass. No applause, no parade. But I didn't need it. They took everything from me, except the one truth they couldn't erase. By Monday morning, Douglas was no longer on the company server, his name stripped from the internal system like dried paint from a wall. No ceremony, no goodbye, just silence. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a clean break. The next Sunday arrived with a soft breeze brushing through the cotton curtains of my kitchen window. I stood at the sink, staring at a stack of name tags arranged neatly in my tote bag. Each one had a girl's name printed in a cheerful font, followed by the words, STEM Horizons Scholar. Across town, at a modest community center where my late aunt had once taught free weekend chemistry classes, folding chairs were being set up in rows. I arrived early. I didn't want applause, I just wanted the girls to walk into that room and see their names on something that said they mattered. I adjusted the projector, ran the sound check, and reviewed the agenda one last time. The mayor was scheduled to speak briefly. So was a representative from Microsoft, who, when he arrived, walked straight up to me, extended a hand and said, "Director Ward, thank you for making this happen." I nodded, smiled, and simply replied, "My aunt started it. I'm just finishing what she never got to." No one from my family was there. No RSVP, no card, not even a sniff of curiosity. I hadn't invited them, not because I wanted revenge, but because peace is sometimes choosing who not to explain yourself to. The ceremony went on. 6 girls, all between the ages of 14 and 17, received their scholarships that day. One wore a prosthetic arm, another used a walker. Every one of them beamed when their names were called. After the last round of applause and a few lingering hugs, I helped the volunteers clean up. It was late afternoon by the time I returned home. The house was quiet, the air still. On the hallway table sat a thick, cream-colored envelope. No return address. But I knew the handwriting. I took it to the kitchen and laid it beside my tea. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I walked to my office, opened the bottom drawer of the desk, and placed the envelope next to a folded copy of the prenuptial agreement, the one Douglas had signed years ago, probably not even reading the clause that would undo him. I stood for a moment, then returned to the kitchen, sipped my tea, and let the letter sit unread, because I already knew what it would say. Something about not knowing, about how Douglas made his own choices, maybe even a line about how we never meant to hurt you. I had heard enough excuses to last a lifetime. My voice, quiet even in my own thoughts, repeated something I'd once whispered to myself on a hospital bed at 17. You don't have to earn the right to exist, and you certainly don't need to accept being erased to keep peace. That night, as the city hushed into street lamp gold, I prepped for Monday's workshop. My laptop pinged. An intern had uploaded lesson plans. I smiled. By Tuesday afternoon, I stood before a group of 7th grade girls, gathered in a circle on the community center floor. We were building assistive tech prototypes, basic circuits, motor-controlled grips, and sensory boards. One girl, Mia, looked up from her design and asked, "Miss Ophelia, is it true you used to be, like, a gatekeeper?" The room went quiet. I crouched beside her, adjusted the small circuit board in her hand, and said gently, "No, sweetheart. I was the architect the whole time. They just didn't know it." The girls blinked, curious but accepting. Kids don't need long explanations. They just need to know you're real. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed and the last student left with her guardian, I sat alone at one of the work tables. My phone buzzed once, a simple notification. Foundation account received full match from private donor $2,000. No signature, but I had a hunch who it was from. Some debts are repaid in quiet ways. I leaned back, closed my eyes for a moment, and let the weight of the past few months sink somewhere I didn't need to carry it anymore. I didn't need a seat at anyone's table. I was building my own, with better lighting, stronger legs, and an open-door policy for every girl who'd ever been told she was too much or not enough. And in that moment, I whispered the truth they never saw coming. What they mistook for silence was strategy.